Welcome back, dear listeners, to another chilling episode of our scary stories. Tonight, we pull back the veil between dream and reality, guiding you down a labyrinth of nightmares and heart-pounding suspense. Ever had a dream so terrifying you woke up grateful it was all in your head? But what if that boundary shattered? What if your darkest dreams broke free, crossing over into your waking life? In tonight's tale, The Dreamcatcher, we explore this horrifying possibility. Buckle up, dim the lights, and prepare to question the boundaries of your own reality. Now, let's dive into the abyss. Ella pressed her temples, a futile attempt to quiet the throbbing headache that pulsated through her skull. Her eyes, weary from another night of tortured sleep, glared at the spreadsheet glowing on her computer screen as if it were an unwelcome intruder. The relentless clacking of keyboards and the chatter of coworkers at the marketing firm where she worked had become a dissonant symphony, each note scratching at her sanity. The air was laden with the aroma of fresh coffee and ink from the nearby photocopier, but even those comforting scents did nothing to lighten her mood. Her nightmares had transformed her nights into a twisted labyrinth of fear, and her days into a foggy stupor. As she reached for her lukewarm cup of coffee, her fingers trembled. Her friend Jane, noticing the slight quiver, sidled up to her desk. "Hey, Ella, you look like you've seen a ghost. Another rough night." Ella sighed. "You have no idea, Jane. It's like my nightmares have found a way to cling to me, even in daylight." "Well," Jane leaned in and whispered, "have you heard about the auction happening at Whitman's? They've got a bunch of old, mystical stuff. Might be worth a shot. Maybe you'll find something to chase the nightmares away." That evening, Ella found herself at Whitman's auction house. The air smelled of aging wood and musty tomes, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the histories of countless civilizations. Intricately carved furniture, exotic textiles, and curios from around the world filled the dimly lit room, each object casting its own web of shadows. An unsettling yet magnetic atmosphere hung around the auctioneer, Mr. Loomis. He was a tall, gaunt man, his eyes sharp like a hawk observing its prey. As he introduced the items, his voice conveyed a strange blend of authority and whispered secrets. Ella, captivated, felt an odd comfort in the room, as though surrounded by a multitude of silent, watchful guardians. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Loomis's voice unfurled, "we have a rare artifact, a genuine dreamcatcher from the Mohaki tribe, believed to trap and banish nightmares." The dreamcatcher was unlike any Ella had seen before. Intricate and otherworldly, its web-like threads seemed almost to shimmer in the low light, and the feathers adorning it appeared more ethereal than earthly. How much for some peace of mind? Loomis smirked as bidding started. Ella felt her heart accelerate, each beat a drum urging her to seize what might be her only chance at serenity. Her hand shot up again and again, each time upping the ante. "Sold to the lady in the black jacket," Loomis declared, his gavel cutting through the tension like a knife. That night, Ella hung the dreamcatcher above her bed, its intricate threads dangling like the remnants of forgotten dreams. The room was filled with a strange tranquility, as if the air itself had been cleansed. For the first time in weeks, she felt her eyelids grow heavy with the promise of restful sleep. The first rays of dawn streamed through her curtains, kissing her eyelids, rousing her from a dreamless slumber. Her room, basked in the morning glow, felt like a sanctuary. She breathed in deeply, relishing the fresh start. However, the jubilant chirping of birds outside her window was starkly contrasted by her cat, Luna, who hissed and growled at some unseen presence. Luna's fur stood on end, her eyes darted around the room as though tracking an invisible intruder. A knot tightened in Ella's stomach, eclipsing her newfound tranquility. The room, once her sanctuary, now seemed to close in on her, a chamber hiding secrets in its corners. The dreamcatcher swayed ever so slightly, as if nodding in ominous agreement. It was as though Ella felt, for the first time, the weight of an invisible gaze. Something had changed, something intangible yet overwhelmingly real. A chill ran down her spine as Ella found herself contemplating an unsettling question. What price had she paid for a night devoid of nightmares? As evening descended, a haunting indigo sky swallowed the day's last amber light. Ella found herself pacing around her living room, feeling the gaze of her antique paintings following her every step. While the dreamcatcher had granted her the reprieve she'd sought, its presence filled her home with an air of anticipation, like a stage set for a play whose script was yet to be written. Her second night beneath the Dreamcatcher came and went without event. Again, she woke without any memory of nightmares. The daylight streaming through her windows should have filled her with warmth, yet all she felt was an icy undercurrent of apprehension. Luna seemed more uneasy too, darting her eyes from corner to corner as if searching for something, or someone lurking in the unseen. In the following days, Ella began to notice oddities that she couldn't easily dismiss. Her heirloom teacups would mysteriously relocate to different cabinets. Sometimes, she'd hear footsteps in the attic when she knew she was alone. At other times, whispery sighs seemed to flutter through her hallways like wandering ghosts. More than once, she caught sight of fleeting shadows at the periphery of her vision, but when she'd turn to face them, they'd vanish into thin air. Each incident was trivial on its own, yet their cumulative effect was a mounting sense of dread. A researcher at heart, Ella dived into online libraries, combing through academic papers and obscure forums to learn more about the Dreamcatcher and the Mohaki tribe it was said to come from. Nestled within the texts were unsettling tales of spirits set free, of shamans warning that the Dreamcatcher was not just a benign shield but a portal between two realms. In her fervor, Ella stumbled upon an unnerving passage. To take away the nightmares, the Dreamcatcher needs somewhere to release them. It does not destroy, it displaces. That evening, Ella noticed something amiss in her garden. A snake, glistening scales like blackened embers, slithered among her rose bushes. It was a spectacle both extraordinary and revolting. Ella felt her pulse quicken. Snakes had been a recurring figure in her nightmares, a symbol she could never quite decipher. She watched it slither away into the underbrush, and a sudden realization gripped her. Could it be that her nightmares were becoming flesh and bone? Luna hissed at the garden from the window, her eyes widened in a feral mix of fear and recognition. And Ella, her eyes meeting Luna's, felt a shudder of agreement. There was no longer room for denial. Something deeply unnatural was happening, and it seemed to be emanating from the Dreamcatcher she'd brought so eagerly into her home. It wasn't just trapping her nightmares, it was releasing them into her waking world. Ella returned to her bedroom, her gaze meeting the Dreamcatcher's woven net and trailing feathers. A soft wind entered through her open window, making the artifact sway gently, as if acknowledging her newfound suspicion. The room was charged with an ominous energy, the walls seeming to close in with the weight of pending doom. While her nightmares had ceased, their malevolent echoes had found new life. Ella's mind raced with questions, each more terrifying than the last. If a simple nightmare like the snake could manifest so tangibly, what would happen when the darker, more malevolent figures of her sleepless nights decided to cross into her reality? She felt the ground beneath her shift into treacherous territory. The boundary between the dream world and her waking life had been breached, and Ella had no idea how to seal it once more. Yet, the most distressing thought was that she might have bought even, this unimaginable horror into her home, a horror that was growing, night by night. The third night under the influence of the Dreamcatcher arrived with an atmosphere so thick you could carve it with a knife. Ella's home, once her sanctuary, now felt like a sprawling labyrinth teeming with invisible predators. Nightfall brought an air of undeniable tension, seeping through the walls like a malevolent mist. Luna, too, could sense it. Her fur bristled as she growled at unseen adversaries. When Ella finally retreated to bed, her heart pounded in anticipation, her ears straining for every creak of the wooden floorboards. Despite the suffocating dread, sleep overtook her. She found herself submerged in nightmares darker and more twisted than ever, haunting faces, spine-chilling landscapes, monstrous forms. Yet every morning, the memories would evaporate like dew under a scorching sun, leaving her only with the raw emotion of unnameable fear. That night was no exception. Upon waking, Ella felt an inexplicable mix of relief and foreboding, as if she had narrowly escaped some calamity. And calamity was precisely what awaited her. The outside world had undergone its own nightmarish transformation. People in the neighborhood spoke of shadowy figures stalking through yards, eerie moans echoing from the nearby woods, and domestic animals turning inexplicably hostile. The worst came with the news of her neighbor, Mark. He was found dead, his face twisted in an expression of terror so intense that it defied description. The police were baffled. The coroner hesitated to give a cause of death. No signs of struggle, no visible injuries, but every indicator that Mark had been scared to death. It was as though something had stolen his very soul. Ella couldn't shake off the feeling that her Dreamcatcher, her supposed sanctuary, had a role to play in this unfathomable horror. Frantic for answers, Ella sought out Professor Daniels, an academic expert in indigenous cultures and folklore. When she explained her situation, his face turned a shade paler, as if the blood had been drained from it. "You've committed a grave error," he said, his voice tinged with grim urgency. "The Dreamcatcher you possess isn't merely ornamental, it's a gateway. You might have unleashed spirits that were never meant to enter our realm." When Ella asked about reversing it, the professor hesitated. "There's a ritual rooted in ancient rites that could force the nightmares back into their realm," he continued, "but it's dangerous. You'd be confronting them directly, giving them a form, a last chance to wreak havoc before being banished." Ella felt her insides churn. "What other option do I have?" she asked, a sense of frantic desperation rising within her. With a sigh, Professor Daniels outlined the ritual. It involved a circle of salt, incantations in the Mohaki tongue, and the voluntary summoning of her deepest fears. Each step was a calculated risk, but if performed correctly, the spirits would be forced back into the Dreamcatcher and could then be banished forever. Ella returned home, the professor's warnings echoing in her mind. She glanced at the Dreamcatcher, its threads now appearing like a tangled web ready to ensnare her in another layer of nightmare. Yet, she knew she had no other choice. She was the unwitting gatekeeper of this waking hell, and only she could end it. As she began to gather the necessary elements for the ritual, salt, candles, and ancestral tokens, Ella couldn't help but wonder if she was about to embark on her own undoing. The anticipation was unbearable, each tick of the clock amplifying the lurking dread she felt. Soon, she would confront the figments of her darkest imagination, give them form, and then, hopefully, banish them back to where they belonged. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but as she looked out into the night, toward the neighborhood now shrouded in inexplicable horror, she knew there was no turning back. And so, Ella braced herself, preparing to plunge headfirst into a world where her deepest fears ran rampant. A world she had to conquer before it devoured everything she held dear. As twilight draped its dimming veil over the sky, Ella could feel her nerves fraying at the edges. Luna sensed her restlessness, pacing around the living room with fur on end, and eyes wide open. Ella double-checked her list of ritual materials, salt, candles, ancestral tokens, and felt her heart gallop like a wild horse. The evening air was stagnant, heavy with the weight of impending doom, each inhalation laced with an acrid scent of burnt wood. Professor Daniels had stressed the importance of her emotional preparation, but how could one prepare for a descent into personalized horror? Nightfall soon settled in, and Ella began the ritual. A circle of salt surrounded her as she sat on her living room floor, the air punctuated by the flickering candlelight casting irregular shadows on the walls. The ancestral tokens, talismans passed down through her family, lay before her. Taking a deep breath, she began chanting the incantations Professor Daniels had taught her, the foreign syllables clinging to her tongue like a forbidden curse. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly, as if the air itself were thickening. Ella's heartbeat resounded in her ears, drowning out the sound of Luna's agitated hisses from the other room. Then, as if beckoned by some dark magnetism, the nightmares began to appear. First, a colossal spider with a sinister human-like face skittered toward her, fangs dripping with venom. Ella's voice wavered, but she pushed through, finishing the chant with a defiant shout. The creature screeched, its form dissolving into a mist that was sucked back into the Dreamcatcher hanging in her room. Triumph and dread coexisted in her heart. One down, but how many more to go? No sooner had she finished the thought than the second figure emerged, a snarling wolf with fur like molten lava, its eyes two glowing embers. Ella's chants continued, each word a struggle as the air grew stifling, as though the oxygen were being sucked out of the room. The wolf lunged at her but disintegrated just inches from her face, its ember eyes dimming into nothingness. A momentary lull fell over the room, and Ella almost believed the ordeal was over. Then she saw it, the final, unexpected nightmare. Emerging from the shifting shadows was a twisted version of herself. This doppelganger grinned malevolently, its eyes hollow pools of despair. It spoke, and its voice was a dark mirror of Ella's own. "You can't get rid of me. I am you, the embodiment of all your failures, all your fears." Cold chills cascaded down Ella's spine. She had never imagined she would have to confront a fractured piece of her own soul. As she began the chant, her voice broke, but she willed herself to continue. The doppelganger laughed, a sound so bitter it cut through the room like a knife. Ella's hands trembled as she reached the climax of the chant. Vanish, she screamed, pouring every ounce of willpower into the word. Her dark twin wavered, its form flickering like a faulty hologram, then exploded into a cloud of mist. Ella gasped for air, her eyes darting to the Dreamcatcher, which now seemed to vibrate ever so slightly, as if warning her. It was not yet over. The fight had been won, but the war against her deepest, most haunting fears, was far from concluded. And yet, for the first time, she felt the tiniest seedling of hope sprout in the scorched earth of her terror-ridden life. It was a perilous hope, born from confronting the monsters that lurked within her own psyche. And as she looked down at the dissipating salt circle, Ella knew the struggle was far from over. With newfound determination, she realized that to end this waking nightmare once and for all, she'd have to delve even deeper into the uncharted labyrinth of her own fears. The night was still young, and the battle for her soul was far from finished. Sunset dwindled into a realm of blacks and softer grays, and the air grew dense with a grim foreboding. Ella's skin was slick with a cold sweat, and she took laborious breaths, each inhale a reminder of the invisible, sinister weight that enveloped her. Luna, her cat, yelled somewhere in the distance, its cries intermingling with the night wind that carried a menacing whisper. As she sat within the salt circle, surrounded by flickering candles that seemed to quiver like her resolve, a dawning realization settled over her. The most dangerous nightmares were not those that crawled in from the abyss, but those born of her own self-doubts, her own insecurities. They were fragments of her shattered self-esteem, grotesque mirrors reflecting her darkest thoughts. As Ella resumed chanting, the air grew electric, the very atmosphere crackling with unseen energy. The walls seemed to close in on her, and her heart drummed a frantic rhythm in her chest. Ella felt her emotional state unraveling, each chant pulling her deeper into an abyss of uncertainty. Her hands trembled as she clasped an ancestral token tightly. Her grandmother's locket, a symbol of strength and resilience. The ritual had reached its volatile climax, and she felt as if she were tiptoeing along the edge of an abyss. Then, in the darkest moment, it happened. A shadowy form began to materialize, nebulous and formless. Ella felt a numbing cold sweep through her, her thoughts darkening, her fears gaining substance. It was as if she were splitting in two, her psyche teetering on the brink of becoming a living nightmare. Her voice quivered, her chants now uncertain, discordant syllables. She was losing herself, losing the battle. But just when it seemed she'd spiral into a pit of her own making, the glint of the locket caught her eye. Its luster pierced through her doubts like a beam of moonlight through a dark canopy. It was as though her grandmother whispered in her ear, a voice from beyond reminding her of her worth, of the love and strength that ran through her veins. With newfound resolve, Ella's voice steadied. No longer was the chant a mere incantation. It was a defiant battle cry. She channeled her burgeoning self-acceptance, turning it into a weapon. The shadowy form wavered, its nebulousness dissolving as though burned away by her newfound clarity. "Begone!" Ella shouted, the rune reverberating with the power of her words. As if answering her command, the shadowy form dispersed into ethereal wisps, sucked back into the Dreamcatcher's woven maze. The atmosphere lightened instantly, the oppressive dread lifting like fog under the morning sun. Ella's surroundings snapped back to reality. The walls ceased their menacing advance, the air its sinister whispering. Ella collapsed, her body falling limp within the circle of salt. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, every muscle aching, every joint crying out in fatigue. But it was a victorious exhaustion, the kind earned through a hard-fought battle. Luna emerged from its hiding place, cautiously approaching her, its eyes no longer wide with terror but shimmering with a feline curiosity. Ella picked herself up, her gaze falling on the Dreamcatcher hanging innocuously on her bedroom wall. Its form seemed to sag, as if drained, its woven threads no longer a snare, but a defeated foe. As she disassembled the salt circle and snuffed out the candles, she realized her house had returned to its original state, but she had been irrevocably changed. The monsters that had lurked in her nightmares and then stalked her waking world had been vanquished, not by some external savior, but by her own inner strength. Though her body yearned for rest, her soul felt lighter, her spirit unshackled. The looming terror that had clouded her life had been dispelled, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, Ella looked forward to the promise of peaceful dreams and brighter mornings. Yet, in the back of her mind, she knew that the Dreamcatcher's threads still held darker horrors, nightmares yet unexplored. But those were battles for another day. Tonight, she had won. Tonight, she would sleep. Morning light spilled into Ella's room, an iridescent cascade of sunshine that broke through the curtains, casting luminous patterns on the walls. A symphony of chirping birds serenaded from outside her window, their melodies evoking an aura of peace that Ella had forgotten could exist. She woke, her eyelids fluttering open to greet the new day. Her first waking thought was not of dread, but of gratefulness. The tense line of her shoulders had relaxed, and for the first time in ages, she felt the weight of her nightmarish ordeal lift. Still, Ella knew she needed closure, a sealing of this terrifying chapter in her life. So, she returned to the professor's cluttered office, its walls lined with ancient manuscripts and artifacts, shadows of forgotten worlds. He looked up as she entered, his eyes widening as if seeing her anew. "You've done it, haven't you?" he said, peering at her through his wire-framed glasses. Ella nodded. "I confronted them, my nightmares. I've sealed them back into their realm." He leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard pensively. "That's an accomplishment few could claim. But remember, some doors, once opened, can never be entirely closed." Her eyes met his, understanding the gravity of his words. Her battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Back in her home, Ella decided it was time to part with the artifact that had set everything into motion. With resolve, she marched to her bedroom, her heart pounding with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation. But as she reached for where the Dreamcatcher had hung, her fingers met empty air. It was gone. She scoured her room, a growing unease blossoming in her chest, but the Dreamcatcher had vanished as if swallowed by the walls themselves. Weeks turned into months, and Ella began the painstaking process of rebuilding her life. Friendships that had been strained under the weight of her emotional turmoil started to mend. She plunged back into her work with a newfound zeal, her thoughts no longer imprisoned by dread. Ella began to breathe again, taking in life's simpler joys, each day a promise of newfound possibilities. Yet, as Ella sat in her rejuvenated garden, now teeming with vibrant blooms and cheerful chirps, the camera would pull back, shifting away from her peaceful tableau. Hidden among the twisted branches of an ancient oak, obscured by dappled shadows, a pair of luminescent eyes watched her. A minor nightmare figure, perhaps the slither of a serpent or the glint of a raven's eye, remained, a reminder that her reality had been irrevocably altered. But this lurking presence was not menacing. It was more akin to a sentinel, watchful, dormant, yet infinitely patient. The story would close on another scene, far removed from Ella's reborn sanctuary. An auctioneer's voice rang out in a lavish hall, echoing off walls adorned with elaborate tapestries and framed artworks. Next up, an antique Dreamcatcher, a beautiful relic from a Native American tribe, said to trap nightmares, he declared, lifting the woven artifact for the crowd to see. A hand shot up in the crowd, a new bidder drawn to the object's enigmatic allure. The gavel fell, sealing not just a purchase, but also setting in motion a cycle that hinted at an eternal recurrence, a dance with darkness that knew no end. And so, in some distant room, in some different life, another Dreamcatcher would find its place on a new wall, its woven threads a complex labyrinth that would soon stir to life, restless, ever hungry, awaiting the toll of nightfall to unleash its dormant terrors upon the world once more. That concludes our spine-tingling journey through the Dreamcatcher, a story that reminds us that some doors, once opened, can never fully close. Did Ella truly escape her nightmares, or has she merely postponed a battle that has no end? Remember, dear listeners, as you drift off to sleep tonight, hanging above your bed might be more than just a decoration. It could be a gateway. Thank you for tuning into our scary stories. Until next week, may your dreams be just that, dreams. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.